Forest Association, forester. If you own a certain number of acres, I believe, you can call them up and they will come out and do a forestry assessment of your land. He knows more details about that. But Catskill Forestry Association is a private nonprofit organization that provides forestry education and services to private forest landowners in the Catskill region. And Ryan is a lead guy there, involved in the creation, administration, and marketing of Catskill Forest Association's programs and events. He's also has a radio show called From the Forest. He's going to tell you about that too. They do the same kind of thing where they have guests over and they talk about forestry stuff and nature and things like that. So really happy to have him here, and take it away, Ryan.
All right, you can hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay. All right, yeah, so I'm the Director of Forest Services at the Catskill Forest Association. I've been there since 2007, and you don't have to own any particular amount of acreage. It can be even one tree. Sometimes we go to people's properties and just assess one tree, or it could be 10 acres, 30, or 100. The average parcel size is 17 acres, so that's our demographic, is someone who owns less than 30 acres. But the Catskill Forest Association was established in 1982, and our mission is to provide services and education to landowners to create healthier forests. And we work within the Catskill Mountains, and that means the 6 counties of the Catskill region. We believe that private land is an opportunity for stewardship, and it's not necessarily vulnerable, but an opportunity to really improve things. So with that being said, I'll get right into it. Tonight's talk is about history, past and present, of the Catskills and Shawangunk Mountains. So I'll get right into it. So the Catskill Forest, who is responsible for it? Who owns it? And a lot of people might think it's the state of New York. They own quite a bit of land. Forest industry, not as much in the Catskill Mountains. Farmers, they own a little bit. Federal government, not at all really in New York State. The majority of people who own it are non-industrial private landowners. So again, the average parcel size is about 17 acres in the Catskills, and in the Shawangunk, it's probably less. So most landowners aren't doing too much with their forest. Doing nothing or letting it go is really the default management strategy for most, and that can be not necessarily a bad thing, it could be a good thing. The largest role model for new landowners is the forest preserve. That's a big landowner, and the paradigm is to let it go and let it grow. But when people do cutting, they usually high grading is practiced, and that's where really simply the biggest and the best quality trees are cut, and the low quality trees are left behind. And that's really another talk, but that's really the most common practice. So a lot of people's forests may look like this. If you're in Rosendale, or if you're in the town of Warsing, or if you're in the town of Rochester, you may have fern, you may have stiltgrass. I'm sure a lot of you have stiltgrass maybe growing in your forest understory. Or maybe it looks like this. You have a lot of birch growing in the mid-story, upper story, and maybe just ferns, and really nothing growing from 5 feet down. Or it's this. This is extreme, but this would be in Harriman State Park after a forest fire swept through and nothing really grows back. So a lot of tonight's talk is I'm going to go back in time, and I'm going to wrap it up and bring it back to the present. But what are the consequences of doing nothing and just letting your forest go? What's the cost of that? So if you do nothing with your forest, you're basically managing by default for shade tolerant vegetation. What does that mean? That's normally the northern hardwoods. So how many of you know what northern hardwoods are? That's basically shade tolerant tree species, your maples, your beech, yellow birch, hemlock. right? So American beech, yellow and black birch, sugar maple, eastern hemlock. The problem with that is that if you're managing for wildlife, it's at the expense of trees that are fruit and nut bearing. Most of your fruit and nut bearing trees are shade intermediate to shade intolerant. Those are your central or southern hardwoods, generally speaking. That's your oak, your hickory, your chestnut, and blueberry and serviceberry, if you're familiar with Juneberry, Saskatoon, same tree. This is just an example of an old apple tree getting shaded out. But so doing nothing can lead to less sunlight in the forest floor, less food and cover for wildlife on the forest floor. And it really leads to one unhappy customer. And I'm sure you're familiar with this animal. It's the almighty white-tailed deer. Okay? And I'm going to talk a lot about deer tonight. Not because, I like big bucks and stuff, although I do. But if you don't satisfy the deer, then a lot of other wildlife are not going to be satisfied as well. They're a keystone herbivore. What that means is if we don't satisfy that deer belly, then they eat everything from 5 feet down. And what that means is there's less food and cover for other wildlife that depend upon those plants for food and cover from 5 feet down. Do people understand what I'm saying there? So this is in the town of Andes in Delaware County. It's very typical in Delaware County to see this. It's just, you have your up above, you have your northern hardwoods, your maple trees growing in the overstory, and nothing growing in the understory. Remember, maple trees are shade tolerant, so they should be regenerating on the forest floor. They're not because the deer are eating them. So the key influences on the forest are really two things, deer and humans. And I'm going to argue tonight that that's probably been the case for thousands of years. So deer and humans. The Nature Conservancy labeled deer browse worse for our forest than global warming by stating, in our opinion, no other threat to forested habitats is greater at this point in time. Not lack of fire, not habitat conversion, not climate change. Only invasive exotic insects and diseases have been comparable in magnitude. We can argue about which threat is more significant than another, but no one who walks the eastern forest today can deny the impact of deer to forest condition. And I would argue more that it's not just forest, it's just, again, it's deer and humans, and they're a big deal in the northeastern forest. So are deer managing your woods? If your woods looks like this, if you have a maple overstory and you have nothing growing in the understory, your forest is being managed by the white-tailed deer, right? You're familiar with this for sure. If you go hiking up in Mohonk Preserve, you have a 5-foot deer browse line, no doubt. This is taken in the town of Rosendale. You have a maple overstory. You have no maple seedlings on the ground. You have a deer issue. So you get the point. Leaving the peas behind. The ferns are really pretty. I like them aesthetically, but they do indicate a deer browse issue because they don't like ferns. It's like leaving the peas behind. So how much browse does a deer consume? It's kind of unbelievable, right? That you would think that deer could really have this much impact, but they really do go everywhere. So people have studied these things. We know more about deer. It's probably the most studied animal in North America, for sure. 4 to 6 pounds per day per deer. And that's over about 1 ton per year per deer. So if you were to go around the forest and, can pick that many buds, you would see why there's hardly any forest regeneration. So it's about up to 4,000 seedlings affected per deer. Oh, look at that, arrows. And everyone can hear me so far? Because I have no feedback on my end, so. Okay. All right, so where's the food and cover? Impacts of low quality deerscapes. The pendulum has swung in the forest. What was once an abandoned farm, right? Let's go back for a second. That was an abandoned farm. At one time, maybe 80 years ago, the farmer quit and it came up with young growth, which is excellent deer habitat. And the deer were overwhelmed. They had way more young growth than they could eat. Well, that forest has matured now. And now what little sunlight gets into the forest floor, fewer deer can eat. So there's very little that grows. So today, the pendulum has swung. We're not farming as much. We're not cutting as much either. We're really not influencing inside the forest. I'm not talking about development tonight. I'm talking about influences in the forest. Humans are not taking an active role, as I would argue, as they used to. So that abandoned farm is now a mature forest. Some are even wilderness areas. There's a lot of areas where I hunt in the Slide Mountain Wilderness area that used to be farms. Some housing developments within a barren forest of little undergrowth. So it's interesting. This picture is taken on an old farm. It's now mature forest. That's very good for certain wildlife. The problem is that when you have a homogeneous forest like this, the deer keep up with anything that grows in the understory. So the other keystone component to humans is, the other keystone component is humans, right? If deer are the keystone habitat consumer, I would argue humans are the chief habitat designer. We are the only ones that can manipulate vegetation. So if the deer are not getting enough food, why? Why is that? It's the lack of sunlight. Think about it. Where do we see deer the most today? Near the roadsides, near your house, right? Near power lines. It's not that they're interested in the vinyl siding of your house or your newest car. They're interested in the new plants that are growing beside your house, right? Or where humans have incidentally or accidentally provided sunlight. So inside those mature forests, there's way fewer deer. So the lack of sunlight, lack of proper management, the lack of cutting, crop tree management I'll get into later. I would argue that humans have an ancient relationship with deer. So as much as humans have hunted deer for thousands of years for food and tools, I think the deer depend upon humans just as much because we do a lot of burning for thousands of years in the forest, not as much today. But in doing so, it produces excellent deer habitat that once they're satisfied, then other tree seedlings can grow. So when deer prosper, other vegetation and animals can too. So what happens when there is an imbalance? When there's not enough cutting, not enough forest management going on, or too little hunting, that deer belly is exhausting the forest floor. And again, as I've said this before, I'll glance over this. This is at the expense of a lot of fruit and nut trees that depend upon sunlight. Think about it. It takes energy to produce a blackberry, a chestnut, an acorn, a hickory nut, a serviceberry. So a lot of those trees and shrubs need a lot of sunlight, and they can only get it artificially. Really, sometimes you'll get microbursts that come through, but for the most part, for thousands of years, it's been human beings that have, I think, traditionally burned. So most of the forest is going towards northern hardwoods. This is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but just be cognizant that it is at the expense of a lot of edible plants, which are in the southern or central hardwood forest type. Minnewaska and Mohonk are losing a lot of their blueberries and their chestnut oak and their pitch pine. They're losing those to red maple trees, sassafras, things like that because of the lack of forest fires. So is this a new thing that human beings have been cutting or doing forest management? Is forestry new? I would argue it's probably not new. It's probably been going on for thousands of years. And the Shawangunk Ridge is an excellent example of ancient forest management that human beings have been managing a long time, I would argue. So let's take a step back in order to go forward. Forest land use history. So like I was saying before, humans are a keystone species. You have the Native Americans, completely different forest management than the settlers. Mostly promoted a pyrogenic landscape. What does pyrogenic mean? It means plants that basically tolerate fire, right? Grasslands, oak, hickory, right? I mean, think about it. In Western New York, they had elk. Elk are a grazer. That means that they must have been burning so heavily that it converted to grasslands. Pretty amazing if you think about it. And bison. But in the Northeast, in the Shawangunk Ridge, most of it was pitch pine, extremely fire tolerant. That's a legacy from lots and lots of fires. When the settlers came, basically they burned as well, but it was to convert the landscape more to livestock. So you're replacing wildlife with livestock. So the elimination of predators is very important. Heavy forest cutting. There's a reason why we call the forest to this day the woods. It's because wood is very important for building our structures to house animals, ourselves. New species introduction, nectaries, honeybees were introduced, new pollinators. Herbivores were replacing, again, the wild ones, such as cows, sheep, goats. And of course, you have new insects and disease. Not all bad and not all good. Although I would say the apple tree and the honeybee were probably the best to come around.
Excuse me, Ryan.
Yes.
Are you saying that the burning of the forests are a good thing? I guess they're burning the understory. So
Yes.
is proper forestry management?
Right. So I'll talk a little bit more about this, but what fire does is that it promotes young growth, which is excellent deer habitat. And when human beings were doing that, they were basically creating quality habitat for the deer. And if the deer are satisfied, then you can get other plants that can grow. Right now, we don't have enough sunlight in our forest, so the deer pretty much eat everything that grows in the forest floor. And it's very difficult to have good quality habitat from 5 feet down. So the burning promoted really good habitat for wildlife, and it promoted a lot of your fruit and nut trees, especially blueberry, oaks, hickories, and chestnut.
Okay.
So fire can be a very good thing. Today it would be very difficult to do fire since it's a legal liability for sure. So most native human habitation like today are close to areas that are near fertile valleys, longer growing season, better quality soil. So the Shawangunk Ridge is surrounded by 3 valleys, right? You have the Rondout on one side, the Wallkill, and the Esopus nearby. And when you burn a mountain, it always burns usually uphill because oxygen feeds it from below. So this area is extremely accessible to human beings for thousands of years. And that's why the plants on this mountain ridge are extremely pyrogenic compared to other areas. You have pitch pine, blowbush blueberry, and chestnut oak. So chestnut oak is the biggest acorn there is out of all the oaks in our area. It's in the white oak family, and the deer love it. So this is where you find most of your oak, hickory, and chestnut. And there's a professor, we've had him on our radio show called, his name is Mark Abrams, but he has found by going back into the survey data, by looking at old survey lines and stuff, that he has actually placed, by looking at the survey, the witness trees rather, it tells him the tree species composition, and a lot of these areas coincide where Native Americans used to live. So he could see where they were burning a lot more. That's a pitch pine tree. It's pretty much the poster child for a tree that can tolerate fire. And the reason why burning promotes certain plants is because they have a tolerance to fire. Oak, hickory, and chestnut. How many of you have tried to transplant an oak tree or a hickory tree? It's really hard because it has a taproot. So when there's a ground fire, they can actually, even if there's a huge fire, they'll die back to the roots and respread. Whereas maple, beech, and birch their roots are extremely shallow, and they'll get killed by fire if there's fires over and over again. Now, even more tolerant than oak, hickory, and chestnut is pitch pine, and these trees look like they're dead after that Shawangunk fire in 2008, and they sprouted back amazingly. This is on the Vernoy-Kill Ridge, and this was an accidental fire from the campers. But I would argue that accidental fire, thank God no one got hurt, but it provided excellent deer habitat. Look at all the cover coming in. So the deer, it was so big that it overwhelmed the deer. Right, they had way more than they could browse. And now you had tons of habitat for ground nesting songbirds. Black bears were in there, grouse. So it was excellent wildlife habitat that was accidentally made. It was just purely accidental. These are American chestnut trees that actually came up and produced chestnuts, and I got to pick them. It was really cool. And then they died back to their roots because of the ancient the disease. So, but this is an ancient forest legacy that you're looking at. This is after that more recent Shawangunk fire in Minnewaska. And again, if you dig down with your boot, it's that the roots are pretty unharmed. That's an oak tree surviving. And they resprout, things grow back. The only areas where you would find northern hardwoods, if you were to go back thousands of years, would be wet areas. And notice this hemlock in the middle of Fly Brook in Minnewaska is on the edge of this swamp, and that's probably because this rock and the stream act as a fire break. Most of this forest is pitch pine, mountain laurel, blueberry, chestnut oak, very fire tolerant tree species. So human beings, I would argue, were creating this ecosystem that was extremely good for wildlife, and again, it satisfied the deer. Once you satisfy the deer, you can manage for other tree species and wildlife. So how do you tell if some place has been burned? Well, if you have a lot of these plants, you probably had a fire at some point. White oak, bracken fern, sweet fern, low bush blueberry, mountain laurel, hickory, chestnut. This is wintergreen. If you see wintergreen alone, it doesn't necessarily indicate fire. And after a forest fire, this is after the Cherrytown one, blueberry, low bush blueberry comes in with these clumps. It actually is easier to pick than high bush. It really responds well to fire. So over time, if there's frequent fires, the red oak will dominate a site, and yellow birch and red maple will die out. They cannot tolerate fire as much. So what's forest land use history like in the last 50 or so years? So we went from the Native Americans burning probably quite a bit. Then we had the settlers who cleared the land quite a bit. What happened in the last 50 years or so? The last 50 years or so has been massive farm abandonment, really 75 years. Most dairy farms went under. And this is probably the most phenomenal thing to happen in the northeastern forest, where the land was 80% cleared in New York State and is now 80% forest today. Well, 65% forested today throughout the entire state. There was, when it first occurred, it was early successional, right? You had all those young trees reclaiming those hay fields, excellent deer habitat, right? The deer had way more than they could eat, and the deer herd proliferated. We had no problem. You could go in your backyard and plant anything you want. You didn't have a deer browse issue in the 50s and 1960s and 1970s, 1980s. Not really until the 1980s, 1990s did you start to have deer browse issues because the forest started maturing. So the last 50 or so years, we have limited forest cutting. There's really virtually no burning. The forests are over 50, 60 years old in most places. And fire suppression is definitely a new thing to occur probably in the last 100 and 150 years. So Smokey the Bear is an extremely successful campaign. He was born in 1944 and successfully put out almost all forest fires. And again, forest fires can be devastating, especially if you're in the wood products industry. But they did provide a diversity of age classes throughout the forest out there. And today we have really one homogeneous age class throughout many areas. So a lot's changed in the last 20 or so years. I'm going to glance through this. This is basically saying how to tell what happened in the past by looking at the trees on your forest today. If you have a lot of shade-tolerant trees, this is just generally speaking. This isn't always true. But maple, beech, birch, hemlock, you probably didn't have as much disturbance in your forest. If you have black birches and white ash and red oak, you may have had some cutting, some clearing, some agricultural history. If you have aspen or paper birch, you definitely had clearing, some kind of large-scale land clearing for farming. White oak, red oak, chestnut oak, those probably burning in the last 250 years or so. Pitch pine, chestnut oak, blueberry. If you have pitch pine, like I said before, you definitely had burning at some point. And honeysuckle, hawthorn apple is more indicative of agricultural past. And blackberry, blueberry, raspberry can be farm abandonment, some kind of microburst fire, some kind of clear cutting. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but mesification is a term that Dr. Mark Abrams from Pennsylvania State University has coined, where the whole northeastern forest is going towards, it's becoming more dense since we're not cutting as much, and going towards shade-tolerant vegetation, which is mostly maple, beech, yellow birch, hemlock. And this has occurred since the 1940s heavily. Yeah, and the most mesic areas are the areas like the Catskills, where human land disturbance from fire was probably less prevalent. So we don't have as much oak as you guys do in Accord and stuff like that. And areas that had more of a fire legacy have more oak, hickory, and chestnut to this day. To this day. Yeah.
Hey, Ryan,
Yes.
you go back one slide there and explain mesic and
Yeah. Yeah.
mesic.
Yeah.
So
mesic is basically includes all those trees that are fire sensitive, shade tolerant, that don't really like too much disturbance in the past. That's your sugar maple trees, red maple, black birch, yellow birch, and hemlock. Those trees don't really need humans too much. They can grow on their own. They'll be better if they're thinned out, but they can grow on their own. Xeric refers to trees that they need disturbance. They need fire, they need cutting, they need farm abandonment. That's your oak, your hickory, your chestnut. So think about it. How many of you have heard of when the settlers landed or in the eastern seaboard, and they found that 1/3 or 2/3 of the forest was American chestnut, right? You've heard that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that tells you what? What does that tell you? The Native Americans, someone was burning heavily. American chestnut is a fire tolerant, and it kind of needs it in order to survive. So that tells me that there's probably a lot more human beings doing something as a forester. That tells me someone was doing something. Does that make sense?
Does that mean that these sugar maples and beech and basswood, are they of less value ecologically than the others?
They can. I mean, you know, I think it was the Cary Institute. They were comparing oak, hickory, chestnut forest to the northern hardwoods, and they found like more reptile life and stuff in the xeric or the oak, hickory, chestnut forest. I mean, I can say that we need a mixture. I'm not going to say one is necessarily better than another. However, the oak, hickory, and chestnut provides more food. There's no doubt about it. It provides way more food than a maple forest. I love maple trees. My daughter's name is Maple. You know, I mean, I love maple syrup, but oak, hickory, and chestnut is really good for wildlife. And having a diversity, I would argue, is probably good. The problem is the whole forest is going towards maple, beech, birch, and hemlock. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Are you going to get into any solutions for that?
Yes.
Possibly? Okay.
Yep. How am I doing on time?
Fine.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I haven't done a Zoom presentation, so it's a different time speed. All right, so the impacts of mesification. These trees, these sets of trees, these yellow birch, black birch, hemlock, sugar maple, they're just taking advantage of the lack of fires, forest cutting that is occurring in our forest in the last 100 years. Does that make sense so far?
Yes, to me.
Yeah, I mean, whereas the oak, hickory, and chestnut, you know, they really took advantage of that initial, when the settlers came. The settlers did burn a lot at first, for sure. But the Native Americans, it's been proven, probably burned as well. The homogenization of our forests is what's going on. The oak, hickory, and chestnut is being replaced over time by the mesic hardwood. So go in your forest tomorrow, and chances are you have an overstory of taller trees growing that are oak and hickory in the overstory, right? And underneath those are maple trees coming up underneath that eventually will shade them out. Okay, that's what happens over time. So you were asking which is better. There's just reduced mass. Mass refers to fruits and nuts. Browse pressure. There's actually fewer deer today than in New Paltz, where I grew up, than there is in the 1990s. In the 1990s, the deer herd peaked in New Paltz. However, the deer browse is worse today. How is that possible? Does anyone have any idea why that would?
Ryan, I muted you by accident. I'm sorry. I was trying to unmute myself and I muted you. I'm sorry. Hold on. Oh no. What have I done? Ryan, are you able to hit the unmute button for yourself? I'm sorry. Your name's right above mine on the list. I just had fast.
How's that? You hear me?
Thank you. Yes. Sorry.
No, it's okay. So everyone get that about the deer herd in New Paltz? A lot of our deer herd in the Accord area and New Paltz actually peaked in the 1990s. However, the deer browse pressure is higher today. How is that possible, right? Isn't that counterintuitive that we would have fewer deer today but have higher deer browse pressure?
Yeah.
The reason why is because as the forest matures, there's less sunlight hitting the forest floor. So there's less plants growing. But so fewer deer can actually keep up with the fewer plants that grow. The problem is they're not equally distributed across the whole landscape. There's actually that we're seeing most of the deer where we live because that's where the young growth is. Our houses basically mimic a disturbance in the forest. The roadway mimics accidentally a cut, a burn, an ancient burn, or the power lines are some of the best habitat for wildlife because they mimic a clear cut, a seed tree cut, what we would call in forestry a seed tree or a shelter wood or a clear cut. So the deer are not equally distributed. We're actually seeing most of the deer right where we live. And that's why the pressure from browse is so heavy. The fewest deer in the state of New York are actually in the Slide Mountain Wilderness area. There's 4 to 8 deer per square mile, and they still have a browse issue. So it's not just about hunting. You can reduce the deer to a very low number and they'll still have an impact. You gotta simultaneously make better habitat by having a diversity of age classes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Right. So fire suppression, we're not going to be able to burn in New York. I've asked about it at the DC, and good luck. That would be a huge liability, and rightfully so, right? There's a lot of houses out there, and that would be difficult. It's okay, I'll get to that, what we can do. So what can be done today, right? That's all the doom and gloom about hey, it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, these are good problems to have. We have more forest today than we did 75 years ago. That's an excellent problem.
Yes, sir.
You know, I mean, we went from having no deer to having a lot of deer. That's not the worst problem in the world. The naturalists that I used to read, like John Burroughs and John Muir and Henry Thoreau, complained that the bear would never come back and the fisher would never come back and the bald eagle, and they were wrong. They have come back. As forests came back, these species came back. So this is mostly optimistic. The only problem is that going forward today, it's not about the abundance of forest, it's the quality. So now we need to do a little more work, I would argue, to get some species diversity by getting back in the woods and doing some cutting to open up some of these fruit and nut trees. So what can be done today? I'll just use our program as an example. It's called the Wildlife Habitat Management Program. And it's basically improving habitat quality to meet the essential needs of wildlife, right? That's a general way of saying it. What we do is we favor fruit and nut trees. And it's nothing more than trying to get sunlight on your fruit and nut trees, right? Because if you don't open up your oak and hickory, they get shaded out by maple and beech and hemlock trees. Understory is more difficult to get. because you have to make a larger cut in the forest to overwhelm the deer herd so you can get actual seedlings growing. Unless you put up a fence, but that's very expensive, putting up an 8-foot fence. But the goal would be to get an understory to grow, because then we would have more cover. For example, if you're a ruffed grouse, our ruffed grouse population has plummeted in the Catskills and the Shawangunks because there's no cover 5 feet down. So they're basically naked out there to predators. The biggest advocate now to cutting is the Audubon Society. We've done a lot of cuts for them, and they'll pay us. Well, they'll go through the USDA. There's a grant. There's a cost sharing program. They're going for 80% canopy openings, right? 80%. You understand what that means? So you're cutting 80% of the canopy in the forest.
Good for them.
Yeah, and trying to get some understory for ground nesting songbirds. It's a lot of work, though. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. It's a lot of work. And we don't have a low-grade market in these areas, so you have to pay for these things. So, yes.
In these areas that they cut back, what are we going to get? Rose and barberry?
Well, the most perfect way to do it is to get rid of those things before you make the cut. However, and this is where I'll part with other people in natural resources, having any kind of cover isn't the worst thing in the world. I've seen plenty of grouse and barberry. I know a lot of people want to chop my head off for saying that, but when you have no cover whatsoever, having a little bit of anything growing at that point isn't the worst thing in the world. Even if you can get some coarse woody debris, what we call, so even if you leave the trees down on the ground, don't take them out, and you can get some kind of woody debris on the ground, at least you have structure. So what I mean is, even if the seedlings don't grow because the deer are hammering them, at least you have some coarse woody debris that serves as a little bit of structure for other wildlife to see cover in. It's something. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Again,
some people will disagree with that, but I've seen plenty of wildlife in some barberry before, and it's not the worst thing in the world, but a lot of people will disagree with that. But again, I grew up in Gardner and New Paltz, and it's pretty bad. The browse is so bad that having any cover is not the worst thing. So remember this, I showed this slide before. This area was cut of oak trees heavily in the 1980s when red oak was really high in price. And since then, it looks like there's a lot of cover, doesn't it? It looks like there's a lot of green stuff. But if you were to take a knee, you would see nothing growing from about 5 feet down. There's really nothing growing except for New York fern. So what we did was we opened up the oak trees. Now this is a very intense cut, but it was to prove a point. This is an oak tree on the left. That's a white birch in the middle, just for scale. And this was really just to open up the oak trees. This is very intense. You don't need to do this intense, but it was something. And I can show you what this site became in a couple of slides afterwards. This is called a patch clear cut. Don't misunderstand. Land clearing and a clear cut are not the same thing. Town comprehensive plans and ordinances confuse the two terms all the time. They're not the same thing. A clear cut is where you cut trees and you want shade intolerance and cover to come in right away. A land clearing is like a parking lot or where you don't want trees to come back. So this is a patch clear cut where we're trying to get shade intolerant vegetation like blackberries to come in. This is even age management, but I won't get into that. And I already explained that. But you're just trying to get those edible plants to come in: oak, cherry, apple, serviceberry, etc. And a lot of these things grew because of what? Accidental farm abandonment. That's why we have black cherry to this day. Serviceberry, apple trees, a lot of these things grew wild because of accidental farm abandonment. Well, we're not going to be lucky enough to have accidental farm abandonment in the future to grow these plants again. Crop tree release. This is something that you can do anywhere. You pick a crop tree. A crop tree is a tree that you want to nourish, you want to keep, you want to preserve. So if you're managing for wildlife, your crop tree might be a black cherry tree, a red oak, a white oak, a chestnut oak, a black oak, and you want to release it from competition on all four sides. All trees at the same height of that tree need to be cut. Those trees should be left on the ground that are cut for wildlife or cover and not taken out of the woods if you don't have to. So we release them from competition. And basically, this saves the trees' lives because if you don't do anything, it gets shaded out by the more shade-tolerant plants or trees. Here's another thing you can do that's kind of cool. It's called hinge cutting. And this kind of serves two purposes. Instead, you only do this on small diameter trees. But instead of cutting the tree down, we cut 2/3 of the way, and it can get more sunlight in the forest, but also provide cover and browse for deer, right? They can stay alive for about 2 to 3 years, and the deer can see cover in them and browse them. Again, I focus on deer because if we don't fill up that deer belly, that deer is going to browse everything in the forest. So we got to try to satisfy it. Does that make sense as hinge cutting?
Yeah, so you're actually providing food for the deer by doing this. And they can come there and they can eat that instead of going around and denuding the rest of the forest floor. Exactly.
You're providing cover for a lot of other wildlife, but you are definitely providing food for the chief herbivore in the woods, which is the white-tailed deer. Absolutely. We've done these cuts in certain areas, and the grouse move right in. They do work. Woodcock, grouse. Someone have a question? So the tree remains, provides immediate food and cover for wildlife, benefits deer, ground nesting birds, small mammals, rough grouse, and more, way more. It's really cool to do. Snag trees, the federal government, the USDA will pay us money to do this as well. You girdle large trees and trees that make sense. We don't just willy-nilly just kill trees. We like to think that we kill the trees that are competing with better quality trees. But you cut 2 rings around the tree, that cuts it off to its nutrients and water, and it becomes excellent flying squirrel habitat, bird habitat, cavities for small mammals. You should see the squirrels that come out of these things years later. It's really good habitat.
Why 2 rings? Why do you need 2 rings?
Just to make sure.
Okay.
Just to make sure it dies. Yeah. You can get away with 1 ring sometimes. Red maple, forget it. It'll stay alive for years. It's very difficult to kill sometimes. It's amazing how that tree just wants to survive. But so it also allows some sunlight to get to the forest floor. But don't think that in our area, that little bit of sunlight is going to provide enough to get tree seedlings established because the deer browse is so high. But you do this around the tree that maybe you like more so that it releases that tree from competition and gets sunlight on it. Sometimes a bald eagle, they'll take residence in these things. Anything can. Barred owls, screech owls, kestrels. So this is a video we did years ago. Let me see if I get it to work. So are deer bothered by the cutting? Notice the time down below at 3:11. We did the cutting. You can see the tree falling in the top right corner. See it? There. Let's see. Well, I'll show it again. There it is. See it fall? All right. So at 3:11, the tree was felled. This is a habitat quality wildlife habitat management program that we're doing for a member. And at 4:25, remember I was trying to make the connection between humans and deer? Deer are curious about what humans do for a reason because they know that when humans are cutting, that means food. They need us just as much as we need them, I swear. This deer was in here at 4:25, the fawn. We provided excellent cover for the deer and browse. They love it in there. And any logger knows this as well. They hang out with loggers, amazingly. And this is at 7:25 that same day. And there's the mom with her fawns. So you're creating excellent deer habitat, good wildlife habitat. Deer. All right, immediate benefits. What's cool about wildlife habitat management, unlike timber, where when you do timber management, that's for decades down the road. And a lot of people, when land tenures are so short these days, convincing someone to thin a stand for timber they might harvest 40 years from now is difficult. The nice thing about wildlife habitat management, it's pretty immediate. You really do see the benefits of this cutting pretty fast. It provides supplemental browse right away. Here's a hinge cut. The deer are in there right away. And they prefer browse in the winter months. Cover, excellent cover for small mammals, and nesting habitat, absolutely. So sometimes if you're lucky, you will get regeneration. That is the main goal. If you can get regeneration, that's great. And that means desirable regeneration. So you were asking before, John, about barberry and stuff. That's not what we want. We would like to have maple seedlings and oak seedlings growing and you know, things that are preferred species by deer, but that can overwhelm the deer and grow. Really, the only place you're going to see that in Ulster County is where there's been a big disturbance, like a forest fire that overwhelmed the deer herd, where you see those kind of preferable tree species growing. So you can have a forest that looks mainly like this, and this is aesthetically, it might be nice, but for wildlife, you're going for multiple canopy stratums and age classes. That's the name of the game for wildlife. You want to see a forest where there's a forest floor that's full of something green growing. Before, after, we got some oak seedlings growing, and this is in Margaretville in Delaware County. Before, after, and it became this 2 years later. This is better than what it was. At least it has some seedlings, it has some kind of shrub layer starting to grow. This is from our drone. Something's growing in there, and it's better habitat than what it was. These are the oak trees that are now, their crowns are starting to expand, and they're healthier trees than they once were. In fact, I'll be honest, the biggest predator of these trees is sometimes black bears. He really went up there, and they go to town on the branches sometimes. I actually had to go up in one and prune out the branches because they were hammering the branches so much when they're eating the acorns. But if you want to know what's growing in your forest and have an idea of what you can do, the Catskill Forest Association is a membership-based organization. You can schedule a forest consultation any time of year. I work full-time there. There's 2 other field staff other than myself and 2 office staff. But membership is $65 a year and $25 for a consultation. But that's about all I have. I'll take questions.
Can you tell us more about your radio show?
Oh, yeah. Every Wednesday since 2010, we have a show called From the Forest from 6 to 7 p.m. on WIOX Roxbury, 91.3 FM. You won't reach it in Accord or town of Rochester, but it's streamed live at WIOXradio.org. But they are archived on our website at catskillforest.org/radio. Or if you're really computer savvy, and I'm not, you can search it on Spotify as well, or Podbean as well. So, yeah. We have almost 500 shows, so there's quite a bit. And if you want to listen to my voice more, then you can go to there, because we interview all sorts of people on there, from college professors to economists to hunters to maple producers to mushroom people, ginseng, you name it, brook trout fishermen. We get a lot of different people. It's a lot of fun.
Do you have any favorite areas that you would consider, say, maybe pristine wilderness or healthy forest?
Yeah. Well, wilderness is difficult to define. I would say, the textbook definition to New York State is where, human influences are absent. I would say areas where human influences are most absent would be the Frost Valley, Slide Mountain Wilderness area. There's the least amount of oak trees there, and probably have been the least amount of humans in that area besides the tanning industry. But as far as diversity goes and really cool places, the Shawangunk Ridge in places is excellent. You have such a diversity of tree species up there because of all that burning for thousands of years. I mean, what other place, you have the whole gamut of tree species from red spruce to the northern hardwoods, maple, beech, birch, hemlock, to look at all the oak trees you have up there. White oak, chestnut oak, red oak, black oak, and blueberry. Some of the largest blueberry stands and chestnut oak stands in the state. So that's a really cool area.
Could you maybe say something about what's happening in California?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about California forestry. The only thing I know is that when you have plants that indicate fire, right? Remember how I talked about pitch pine? And pitch pine indicates that human beings have been burning there, and it indicates that fire will probably happen again. In the Northeast, fire is 99% of the time human caused, because when we get lightning, we get rain. But out west, they get natural fires. It's much drier. And remember I talked about fire suppression? So because we've been suppressing fires a long time, your fuels have been building up for a long time. And I remember when I was in forestry school 15 years ago or so, they predicted California fires would be an issue because the fuels and fire suppression have been building up for a long time. The other thing is when you put houses there, there's going to be more damage because, there's something to burn. It's kind of like a hazardous tree. A tree is only hazardous if it falls and there's a house nearby, right? If it falls in the woods, it's not hazardous, right? So if you have a fire and there's houses, then it's a problem. So to answer your question, and I think I just wrote about this in an article, is it climate change or is it cultural change, right? I mean, that's what people are wondering. I would say it's probably both, but I think we've undervalued the cultural changes going on in California and most of the northeastern forest. There's been a lot of cultural changes that have been impacting our forest. And, we do need to get out there again and do things that human beings have been doing with thumbs and providing sunlight for a long time, I would argue, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Well, I'm from California, and when I was growing up, the summer it never rained. In like 3 months, there was no rain in the summer. And
That's
they used to burn the hills. Like I'm from the Bay Area, and they used to burn the hills to try to prevent fires and stuff.
Yeah. And around here, people used to burn up until the 1940s before refrigeration and stuff for blueberries. I didn't really go into it much, but the most pyrogenic areas in the Hudson Valley, where you find plants that are most indicative of fires, are in the escarpment area. Do you know what the escarpment area is?
Yes.
That's where basically the Rondout Valley or the Hudson Valley meets the Catskills, right? Why would that be? Because the human beings that have been living in those fertile valleys for probably thousands of years had access to those accessible mountains, and the fires would burn uphill. So think about it. Overlook Mountain, Cherrytown Mountain, Mumbaka's Samson Mountain, the Shawangunk Ridge were all heavily burned. But they haven't been burned in a long time. And,
That near us.
What's that? Oh, I thought someone said something. But, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, when I was in college, they talked about this being a problem with the fuels building up. And, this is maybe the price that's being paid. I don't know.
I got a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, where do you see our local forests in, say, 20 years?
Yeah, well, in 20 years, I would think that the oak and hickory are going to continue to dwindle. And this is funny because I was talking about cultural versus climate change. These are southern or central hardwoods, so you think temperature would increase oak and hickory, right? That they would move north. But actually, they're going to become less abundant because the maple trees, the northern hardwoods, are going to prosper because there's no disturbance going on. They'll overtake more of the oak and hickory. Now, there are some that are claiming that as our forests become more dense, meaning the stems per acre, that's what I mean by density, stems per acre. that they might be more susceptible to insects and diseases. You've probably noticed we have a huge amount of insects and disease issues going on in our forest today, right? Many of them are non-native, and some aren't. Some are native, but some are arguing that, like Mark Abrams from Penn State, that this densification might be making our forests less resilient. But I think the jury's still out on that.
Excuse me, I have a question. Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
No pressure.
Yes.
How worried are you about oak wilt?
Yeah, oak wilt. The DEC was talking about it at a conference I was at, and it can be a huge problem. I think that's the one that spreads through the soil, the roots or whatever, and they have to cut the roots and all that. But I'm not that familiar with it in this area. I don't think it is here yet. I think they found it in central or western New York. But maybe it's more. Maybe oak trees are more susceptible to it as they get more competition from this northern hardwood forest. I don't know. I just wrote an article called Maple and Oak, and the two I don't think mix very well.
What are some of the most common tree, not necessarily diseases, but funguses in this area? I'm on Cherrytown Mountain. I noticed that a lot of our trees are covered in what looks like a fungus, but I don't know if it's just a mold that they're getting along with, or if that indicates of the disease.
One problem that is going on is, we are getting a lot more rainfall, it seems, right, in the last few years. And this is really devastating to evergreen trees. Even Norway spruce is getting blights. White pines are getting blights as well, fungus. Because think about it, as you get more rain, that spreads more spores. But the hemlock, if you live in the Cherrytown area, they are getting devastated in our neck of the woods by the elongate hemlock scale and the hemlock woolly adelgid. They suck the sap from the needles, and it kills the tree within 8 to 12 years. So you might be seeing that.
It's interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Elongate hemlock scale. It's little brown coverings on the underside of the needles. Those are the females that overwinter. If you have that, you might confuse it with woolly adelgid. For some reason, the elongate hemlock scale does not have a media rep, and no one knows about it, but it's way worse to treat than the hemlock woolly adelgid. It's terrible.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I got a question from Steve. I think he meant to send it to the group and sent it to me privately, but he said he had his land timbered twice in the last 30 years, just selected cutting. And the only thing that's mostly taken over is beech and fern, but his neighbor had his done and it looks like a jungle. And he's wondering what might be causing that.
Yeah, you know what? Maybe he had advanced regeneration before his neighbor maybe had something growing already, like maybe barberry or multiflora rose, and then when he cut it, it just released it, right? Whereas he didn't have anything growing to begin with, and the only thing that'll grow is fern or stilt grass. Usually, it'll seed in. The problem with doing a small cutting, cutting that isn't many trees, is that it's never enough to get regeneration in our neck of the woods because it doesn't overwhelm the deer belly, right? That's the problem.
You mentioned earlier that the plants that tend to be, that baby maples would be growing in the undergrowth, and that in a couple of years they're going to shade out the older trees in the overstory.
Yeah.
Should I be pulling up baby maples?
Not the babies, the ones that are at the same height. So all this stuff I've been talking about, releasing trees, this is all chainsaw work. You'll be lucky to have maple seedlings growing on the forest floor because the deer usually get to them. If you do, don't count on them being around in a year because they're not considered successfully established until they're above 5 feet. If you can show them, if you see maple seedlings above 5 feet in your neck of the woods, take a picture of it and send it to me because that's rare.
Okay.
Yeah,
And
please.
put a fence around it.
Yeah, put a fence or a tube around it or something.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's only competing with a tree if they're at the same height.
Okay. Never mind.
Understood.
Yeah.
No, don't hold it.
Well, I don't understand.
I can
Hello?
hear you. Yeah, I can hear
Can
you.
you hear me? Oh, what about climate change and maples?
Climate change, I mean, I would say that it would probably help it a little bit if it means more rain, right? But I would argue, I was just writing about this in an article, that I would think cultural changes are going to benefit maple way more than climate change because of the lack of cutting in the forest.
I've heard that the climate change is bad for sugar maples, that they suffer because of it.
Yeah, we're not seeing that at all. It's successfully outcompeting our oak trees, and our most abundant tree species, number 1 and number 2 in New York State, are red maple and sugar maple. Yeah. And the USDA Forest Inventory Analysis data, it's called FIA data, the oak hickory are just going down there because of the lack of sunlight. And that's why this whole thing is very confusing to the public, where you would think that central and southern hardwoods like oak and hickory, with climate change, right, with increasing temperatures, would come into the area and move north. And that northern hardwoods like maple trees would go away, right? Isn't that intuitive? It's not happening. The maple trees are staying put or proliferating, and the oak and hickory are going away.
I see hickory trees all over the place. Baby saplings, saplings all over.
That's good. Yeah. And if they're above 5 feet, that's really good. Usually they're right by the road. And if you walk in the woods, there's not as many. It's not to say that there aren't oak and hickory trees out there, but there are very few that are regenerating, that are successfully regenerating. And the problem is there's very few maple trees regenerating too. The difference is that oak and hickory in the mid-story and overstory can't compete with each other. Those oak and hickory cannot compete in the canopy stratum with the maple trees.
Is there any possibility of ash coming back?
Not for the foreseeable future. No. The lake states already went through this in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and it's wiping out at least 95%. So.
We heat our house with wood. We go through about 6, 7, 8 cords a year. Should we be not burning oak?
No, I burn oak. As long as you season it for 2 years, it's the best wood there is.
No, I know, but I mean, you're talking about promoting oak, right?
Yeah. Well, hey, if there's an oak tree that has a dwindling crown, and we do that on consultations, how do you know which tree to cut for firewood? If it looks like a little Q-tip crown and it's not going to make it anyway, and it's competing with a better quality oak or a better quality sugar maple. I've been really beating up on maple, but I love maple trees just as much. Then it makes sense to cut that oak tree. If that oak tree is not healthy and it's not going to make it anyway, or it's competing with a tree that you like more, there's no problem cutting an oak tree. No problem with it. You know what, too? Chances are you have 2 or 3 oak trees right next to each other. Instead of having quantity, have quality. Pick the nicest one and leave it there with the biggest crown, and cut the oak trees that are adjacent to it so that you can foster that nicer one.
Well, we're talking about firewood, which we buy from, loggers.
Oh, well, it's already cut down. With oak tree, just make sure that you probably already know this since you burn so much wood, but it just needs to be seasoned for 2 years.
Oh, yeah, no, that's
I think it's the best firewood. It's excellent firewood, that and beech.
Hi there. Can you guys hear me? I have a question on ash, and we're treating some of our trees.
Yeah.
It's every other year, and we have some really old, beautiful ones that the crown is still green. Is this worthwhile? Are we going to have the last 5 ash trees in America, or?
Yeah. We actually treat trees as well at the Catskill Forest Association through our Tree Saver program. I inject them with a chemical every 2 years. Yeah, it works. You just have to
that's
keep.
What we're doing, and they
Yeah.
seem to be thriving.
Yeah, keep doing it. You'll probably have the only healthy ash trees around. We only recommend it when it's a legacy tree, which it sounds like it is to you, and it's a tree you want to preserve. There's nothing wrong with that, but you will probably have some of the only ash trees around.
And is there any value in, I don't know, taking core samples or something that do they become resistant by doing this, or do you need to can they be grafted? They're going to be used for science somewhere or are they just basically a tree that's got a vaccination?
The tree's getting a vaccination. Other than that, I don't know of anyone going around the Catskills doing that. I've heard of a seed program going on, but no, you're just inoculating that tree and pay attention to it. Pay attention to its crown. Make sure it's healthy enough. But yeah, every 2 years, just keep doing your treatments.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Speaking of the ash tree, have they found, they're looking for ash trees that are immune to the emerald ash borer. Do you have any idea what kind of percentage they've found that are immune to it?
I thought I read that maybe 1 to 3%. I'm not sure, but you know what? There's got to be something immune to it. But so if you see an ash tree, especially in the Rondout Valley, that's completely healthy, hey, you never know. Because at this point, most of them are dead or dying in the Rondout Valley. A lot of them look terrible. So there's a chance that one of them could be immune. Why not?
Anybody else? Get your questions answered.
Ryan, can you tell us if you said catskillforest.org. Is there any other contact information that we can give to the group if anybody wants to get in touch?
Yeah, if you want to get in touch with me, particularly, it's my first name, Ryan, R-Y-A-N, at catskillforest.org. But if you want to just send an email to us, it's cfa@catskillforest.org. But all the contact information's on that website. And I live in Sampsonville, so I'm pretty close to you guys. It would probably be me or Zane, who he's in Kingston, who would come to see you if you ever wanted us to visit your property.
Well, thank you so much. What a great presentation and very, very fascinating. We'll have to watch it again later on to catch it all.
Yeah, I hope it made sense. It's hard to do it over these things, but yeah, I hope it made sense.
No, that was super, Ryan. Thank you very much.
It was. Thank you.
Fantastic. Really learned a lot. So thank you.
No, thanks for having me.
So next month we have Andrew Faust and Chris Hewitt. They're going to talk about a new park in Rochester. They installed, I don't know, I guess 35 acres of solar panels behind the Rainbow Diner. They cut down 35 acres of trees to do that. But the forest around those panels that are left are actually pretty nice. They're just covered with a lot of invasives and it requires some forestry management, but there's some really nice things in there. And they're planning on teaming up with us and with ECC and Riverkeeper and Watershed Alliance, Rondout Creek Watershed Alliance, to restore certain areas of that and create some hiking trails for the people to become a park with signage on what some of these trees are and shrubs, some of the native shrubs. So they're going to talk about that project next month. Oh yeah, and underneath the solar panels, it's going to be a pollinator garden. So like a pollinator meadow. So they're going to talk about that next month. And after that, we have the Hudson River Watershed Alliance. We'll give a talk about some aquatic animals and things like that that you would be probably interested in finding out about. So tune in, give us send us an email, and we will put you on the mailing list. It's what is it, Rochester ECC?
Rochester.ecc@gmail.com.
What was that again?
Rochester.ecc@gmail.com.
Okay.
I'll put it in it's in the chat box to everybody right now. How's that?
Yeah, that sounds great. So keep
Thanks,
tuning
everybody.
in. Thank you. Thanks for coming, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.